third property of sound is duration. This property relates to notes and rests. When you memorize all the note and rest values, you've opened up the door towards performing, creating, and being able to respond to music, as the first three properties of sound is what the written form of music communicates. All that's left to do is work towards applying everything that you've learned from the pitch, intensity, and duration lectures. So let's start understanding that music is based on a consistent pulse that we call a beat. There are two types of musical beats that musicians talk about: a downbeat and an upbeat. This is the and. When you count rhythms, when you count a beat, and sometimes what helps keep the pulse of music consistent is having a metronome. So when you're counting, the clicks is 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice those clicks come on the number. Now, the space in between the clicks, equally distributed, those are the upbeats. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. That's an upbeat.
The and comes in between the numbers and the space of the clicks when using a metronome.
The beat of music can change when your tempo markings change. So I have a metronome here, and it's going at quarter note equals 60, which is typically the pulse of a regular heartbeat at rest. The beat of music can change when the tempo markings, which you can find at the right above the first staff, you'll either see a quarter note equals a certain number. If you had quarter note equals 60, you would have a beat that's this fast. Or you might have Italian terms: largo, moderato, presto. Those numbers and Italian words provide a suggestion in regards to how fast the piece should be performed at. Now, notice I emphasize performed at, not practiced. When you take any piece, then you're going to learn it. You're going to want to take it at a slower tempo. My suggestion is always start at quarter note equals 60, which is this tempo right here, and either increase your tempo until you feel more comfortable with the musical excerpt that you're playing, and then increase it a little bit more. If a musical excerpt is still challenging, you're going to do the opposite and just slow it down. Again, the concept of balance and having counterparts continue to apply in this property. So you have sounded beats, which are your notes, and you have the opposite or the antithesis of a sounded beat. So anything that makes a sound that we hold or we play, we hear a pitch, are notes, and when it's silent, they're rests. So please notice that whole note is spelled with a W. W-H-O-L-E represents something that is of a whole piece, like a whole pizza. However, if you spell it H-O-L-E, you're referring to an opening, a hole in your pair of socks. It's really important that you spell words correctly. So a whole note is an oval-esque shape. It doesn't necessarily need to have these thicker lines here. On printed music, you will see it with the printed lines there. A whole note will get 4 beats. Now, the antithesis, or the opposite of a whole note, is a whole rest. We keep the first word the same. The only thing that changes is whether we call it a note, which makes a sound, or a rest, which stays silent. So one of the best ways to remember what a whole rest looks like is using that homophone. If you stand here on this plain flat surface and you were to dig a hole, a H-O-L-E hole, to the other end, and then fill it back up with dirt, you created a hole. And it still gets 4 counts. Next, we have a half note. So we go from a whole to half, just like if you had a whole dollar and you cut it in half, you'd have a half dollar. You again have the note head. The only thing that's different between a whole note and a half note is that now you've added this vertical line, which we call a stem. So you have a half note, and you have to have its opposite partner, which is your half rest. One of the best ways to remember what a half rest looks like is to think of a hat, because hat and half, the same first two letters, and it kind of looks like a hat. Again, the counts for a note are the same, or the exact same that you have for a rest. So continuing to use the money analogy, if you were to break a half dollar in half, you have quarters. The difference between a half note and a quarter note is simply that the note head has been shaded. I'm hoping that you're seeing kind of a pattern. We went from a whole note and you divided it by 2. You get 2 counts, divide it by 2 again. You have 1 count. Should be no surprise to you that you have the opposite. Again, the only thing that you're doing is changing from note to rest. And this looks like a Z and then a C. So to draw a quarter rest, it's a Z and a C. We can get even smaller with an eighth note. You still have your note head. You have your vertical line, which we call a stem. The difference between a quarter note and an eighth note is that now we've added a flag. Keeping in with the mathematical pattern of dividing by 2, you take 1 and divide it by 2, you get your half, or if you prefer writing things in decimals, 0.5. So notice on the eighth note you had a flag. That still carries over, that concept carries over when you have an eighth rest, except for your flag looks more like this. Again, counts are the same. The difference that we have between an eighth note and a 16th note is the fact that we've added another flag. One flag represents an eighth note, 2 flags, there's your 16th note. You took 1 half and divided by 2, you'd end up with a fourth. Notice again you have the 2 flags here. That same concept comes across when you're talking about your 16th rest. There's your first flag and then your second flag. Again, the counts are the same. So notice, yes, there's more vertical lines. However, this vertical line, and yes, there's more. And all these vertical lines are separating the staff. That's what we call a bar. In between the bars are what we call measures. So if we were to count how many measures we see here total, we would start from where the clef is at to this bar line, call that 1. From this bar line to this bar line is another measure, and so forth. And we keep counting. So on the screen right here, you see a total of 8 measures. Now if you notice, at the very end, this bar does not look like this bar. That's because it's called a double bar. So when you have numbers next to the clef, be it treble clef or bass clef, in this case it's bass clef, it has a specific purpose. It's what we call our time signature. Now, our time signature tells the number of beats per measure. That's what the top number is. The bottom number tells what note value gets the beat. If the bottom number is 4, it's telling us that it takes 4 of these type of notes to equal a whole note. the number 4 here on the bottom tells us that a quarter note is what we're basing all our counts on. So that means our quarter note is our 1. So every measure here has to contain a total of 2 beats or 2 counts in every single measure. Measure 2, we have measure 3, and we have measure 4. And our exercise ends with a double bar. Remember that a double bar shows the end of a piece. So if we were to count this out, we have a half note, a quarter rest, a quarter note, a half rest. Remember, it looks like a hat. And we have some eighth notes and an eighth rest. Again, every measure has to have a total of 2 count in it. So the way that our brain is going to count this is that every measure starts with 1 and ends with 2. Because our top number tells us this is how many beats that has to exist in every measure. So the beginning of every measure, we will always have 1 and then 2. So our brain is counting 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Here, because we have eighth notes, which is taking a quarter note and dividing it in half, we're going to subdivide using an upbeat. So we have 1 and 2 and. Like I said earlier, that 4 tells us that our counting is based on a quarter note. So you notice here in this measure we have a quarter rest and a quarter note. Each of those quarter notes gets 1 count. So in purple, our brain is going to count with the metronome at a tempo of quarter note equals 60. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and 2, and. That's what our brain is counting. However, when we play music, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the rests and how long we're supposed to extend the note for. So remember, rests are silent beats, and we don't say anything. So the way we would count this in time would be 1, 2, 1, and 2. We can also have a different time signature. In the other exercise, we had 2, 4. Now we have 4, 4. Remember that the top number tells the number of beats, or what we can be called counts, that exist per measure, while the bottom number tells you what note value gets the beat. And if you remember from the last exercise, that the 4 represents the quarter note as our count, as the basis of 1. So
our brain will count this.
1, 2, 3, 4. In every measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every measure has to have 4 counts, or 4 beats in every measure. So regardless if we have a note or a rest,
our brain keeps a consistent count.
And if we set this up with our metronome, setting the tempo at quarter note equals 60, each click representing a downbeat, we get this. Now if we were to count this with what we actually say, not with what our brains are doing, we would count this as 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 4. Just because a rest exists doesn't mean that we ignore the count. That's why we don't just completely go from here. 1, 1. This rest still exists. We have to be silent for those 4 counts in which our brain is counting those counts. So you'll notice on this exercise below, it's the same rhythm as the one above it, with the exception of we're going to add what looks like colons here at the very end. Now, instead of a double bar, like you see on this exercise above, we now have a repeat sign. A repeat sign tells us, hey, you have to go back and repeat the entire phrase that you just played. So when we see our repeat sign, we're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning and repeat the segment again. So let's alter the tempo and go a little bit faster. We'll set it to quarter note equals 80. And as you can see in the exercise above, again in purple, our brains are counting up to 4, each measure beginning with 1. And in green is what we actually say, starting to count from the beginning here. 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 4, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 4. But wait, there's more. As you can see here, the third one has the same exact rhythm as we had in the first one and the second one. Now we've changed it to where we have the repeat sign like we have on the second example. The difference now is we're going to add another repeat sign, which we have here a forward repeat sign, which is different than the second exercise. In the second exercise, the repeat sign told us that we needed to go back to the very beginning. Here on this third exercise, we do have a repeat sign. However, because we have a forward repeat sign now, we don't go back to the beginning. We restart the rhythm back here. So this exercise would go like this. 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 4. 1, 3, 1, 1, 3, 4. So notice we took the repeat sign, but we didn't go back all the way to the beginning. We went and started here at measure 2. That concludes our lesson for duration.